So, I've been writing and world building for a while and love to peruse the best and the worst of others' work. And through it all, I've committed and seen in others some pretty similar mistakes, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. This video should be useful to you whether you're doing just a world building project, making a tabletop RPG campaign, or writing a book. And when I say mistakes, what I mean is any decision within your world building that'll result in inconsistency, confusion, or irritation from the people who engage with the world you've created. If you find yourself making any of the mistakes mentioned in this video, don't panic. The nice thing about writing and world building is that you can always go back and change stuff, and it doesn't make you dumb either. Everyone does most of these mistakes at some point. But without further ado, let's get started. Mistake 1, an inconsistent tone. In a world of darkness, blood, and suffering, there lies one hero who may be able to save the day and restore light to a fallen world. He must triumph over countless evils almost unspeakable in their wretchedness. This is a world of the selfish, the greedy, and the cruel, and only an individual of unmatched mental and physical fortitude stands a chance at surviving. This hero is Dobby, the house elf. While this is obviously a pretty extreme example, it goes to serve the following point. Worlds tend to have a relatively consistent tone to them. Lord of the Rings is heroic, mythical, and concerned with the struggle of good versus evil as overruling concepts. Warhammer 40,000 is grimdark, where even the heroes perpetuate the cruelest regime imaginable. Pokemon is a generally lighthearted game about kids running around and making animals beat the crap out of each other. All of this is very obvious when I tell it to you, and that's because you intuitively understand the idea I'm going for in describing these settings, even if you aren't particularly familiar with them. However, this kind of mistake can be harder to detect in your own writing. Sometimes you'll be tempted to throw in something, maybe a little inspiration from here or there, that's different in tone from what you may be primarily drawing from, and it just won't quite fit. Obviously, I'm not saying your world should be one note, but you're aiming to create a consistent vision of your world, something that can be described or summed up in the way I just did for the examples I gave. Those descriptions may be reductive, but they're important for your audience's understanding of your world. If you go to describe the tone of your writing and you start saying, well, it's morally gray, but it's pretty lighthearted and funny with some grimdark every now and again, you haven't really said anything. It's optimistic, pessimistic, and the middle all at the same time, and maybe it is in parts all of those things, and maybe that works as it's doled out, but there needs to be something unifying. The heroism of a world like Lord of the Rings will be different from the heroism you'd see in 40K, which would be different from the heroism of Pokemon. And to segue us into the next section, I'll do a summary for my own world just to give you an idea. My world is held in a balance of good and evil, like Lord of the Rings, but it is the natural imperfection of humans that leads good people to become corrupt and do evil, though some will always remain pure of heart even against all temptations. Obviously, none of this is groundbreaking or super new, but it is consistent. Mistake 2, moral myopia. The easiest way to explain what this concept is to say this is the mistake of about 90% of cases where I hear someone call their world or characters morally gray. This is not inherently a mistake in of itself, but in my experience, morally gray has lost a lot of its power as a descriptive term. It has become super overused and often becomes one of these two things. Either one, it's my characters are dark and edgy, but only do superficially evil things like traffic violations. Or, my characters are dark and edgy, they kill people for fun, but they are the good guys, I swear. For whatever reason, the main thing that comes to mind when I think about this sort of thing is bad romance novels where the main guy is like some genocidal dictator or murderous mobster. But the point here is that sometimes in the pursuit of vibes, which is a word I use a lot because it's so central to how people view media, people often sort of let the fine details of what actually happens in their world fall by the wayside, and it leads to some odd and pointed questions. This is often one of the most unintended of these mistakes, in that it can be one of the most subtle and sometimes the one most likely to be caught too late. One of the more common examples floating around in the past few years is the idea that the house elves of Harry Potter are kind of messed up when you think about how they're handled. Hermione wants to free them, and she essentially gets hit with the "they're happy as slaves" argument, which is played for laughs. Now, I'm not the guy who's going to get all that upset about a joke in poor taste in a kid's book series, but it is a little weird when you think about it. In general, I'd say the best way to prevent this is to take the concept, event, or character you're in doubt about and just tally up the most notable things about it, and then compare those things to how you want this concept to be viewed. If you realize it may not be consistent that your evil empire run by a 2,000-year-old vampire offers free ice cream to all citizens on Fridays, this can be a good way to catch it and decide whether or not that is a detail that you actually want to keep. Mistake 3. Illogical tech distribution. The continent of Continentia was once split in two. On the west was the empire of Industrial Revolutionia. On the east was the kingdom of Feudalia. They fought a massive war that lasted a long, harrowing 4 days. The empire of Industrial Revolutionia, as it turned out, had tanks. This mistake will harken back a good while to my old world building tech levels video, so you can check that out if you want, but essentially the idea here is pretty obvious. While there can be a lot of clever ways to have technological disparities in your world, it's possible to stretch it to the point of losing believability. To be frank, this is the sort of mistake that is mostly just the result of carelessness or a lack of knowledge, as opposed to inexperience, like most of the rest of these. If you care enough to look up and research stuff about world building, you're a bit more likely to care enough about the fine details. If you're working with stuff you're unfamiliar with, such as how Renaissance warfare works, so you could implement it into your fantasy world, some research can't hurt. The mistake you might be a little more likely to make, however, is what this mistake is actually named for: distributing the tech you do have in ways that don't really make sense. The example I used at the beginning to start makes no sense because the border between two neighboring countries is just not a strong enough barrier to prevent the exchange of technology to that large of an extent. Ideas pass through borders as easily as people do, especially in pre-modern settings. Instead, massive differences in technology should be justified by considerable distance, particularly via vast expanses of ocean or other more effective boundaries, maybe mountain ranges, magical barriers, or just mutual incomprehensibility. This is best exemplified by humans in Warhammer being unable to understand how orc technology works, mostly because it doesn't. Mistake 4. Sticking too closely to archetypes. So tell me about your new fantasy people. Well, they're an empire structured like Rome was. Oh cool, what's their religion like? Well, they have a pantheon. It's actually kind of like the Roman pantheon. Ah, okay. How's their military organized? Well, their army is called the Legion, and their best soldiers are called Praetorians. Pretty cool and original, right? This is one of those mistakes that if you've made, you may logically realize it, but have a difficult time admitting to yourself that you've done it. This is generally because this issue comes from you being really inspired by one or two things in particular, and jamming as much of that as possible into your world building without letting it breathe or become its own thing. Trust me, I know. I have done this, and the time spent editing it away has taught me how to look out for it. Don't get me wrong, it's good to be inspired or interested in another historical entity or fictional property, but no matter how much you love making your own version of it, in all likelihood you will just be making a worse version of the same thing. A fool's gold that may look the same but not have the same value. Instead, for one, bring in elements from just other concepts, and 2, find meaningful ways to evolve the ideas introduced in that thing you like rather than just imitating it. First draft of my book, for example, was pretty much just a ripoff of Fire Emblem Three Houses. Put that on the record because everyone who's read that sorry first draft knows it's true. However, over time, not only did I begin pulling from other things, but using those other things to make something that can actually stand on its own. The main way in which I did that was in identifying what I didn't like in that thing I loved. Three Houses is my favorite game of all time. I mean, I've got a freaking Switch case of it. But it isn't perfect, and there are a lot of things it didn't expand upon that I thought it could have, or in directions it could have taken but didn't. So I worked off of those things I wished it did, brought in other ideas of my own, and now my story is properly its own thing. Mistake 5. Avoiding every possible archetype. This is one that's difficult to even make a comical example for because by necessity the mistake here is that you make things so complicated where it's basically impossible to explain briefly. But essentially this mistake is being so afraid of being like anything else, whether it's being at all reminiscent of real life or of another fictional entity, that you make something that ends up being too esoteric for anyone other than you to understand it. I've heard people less familiar with the world building world essentially identify this mistake, but they might just say it's too weird. Weird is not a problem. Lots of excellent stuff is very weird. Instead, weirdness can become a problem when it becomes obscure. Perhaps you've invented a governmental system unlike anything seen before on Earth. That's pretty cool and pretty impressive if that's what you've done. And having details like that make something completely unique to you are great. But if the terrain of the country led by this government is also completely alien and unlike anything else, and the people that live there are not humans but some new species unlike anything else, and the language they speak has unheard of before rules, and their technology functions fundamentally different, and on and on. If every single element demands an in-depth explanation, you'll have pulled so far from what people understand that your world will become impenetrable. And if you're just making it for you, that's essentially fine. But if you expect others to get into it as well, you need to give them the baselines to work off of. I also don't mean dumb your world building down. One of the main empires in my world is best described as basically the Holy Roman Empire. It's an easy explanation and gives people a baseline for what it is, but that doesn't mean it's literally just the HRE with no other depth and nothing else of its own. Obviously, my point with this mistake and the last is that you need to strike a balance between having inspirations and also having things that can be understood by the audience. Obviously, my point with this mistake and the last is that you need to strike a balance. Mistake 6, excessively overt theming. Now, you might say,
"But J-Bat, this is a writing issue, not a world-building issue."
and you're kinda right, but not really. All world building is writing anyway. The point is, if you do have a plan for a general theme or idea to get across, which if you intend to tell any sort of story you should, you don't want to beat your audience over the head with it. This can be anything from a moral of the story to political messaging to an overall worldview. These are important and can and should be a part of your story if they're motivating you, but no matter how good they are or you think they are, your audience will hate it if you beat them over the head with it. Just imagine watching your average mid-quality kids show. What are they infamous for that makes them basically unwatchable for adults? The fact that half the time they have to say, "and the moral of the story is," and literally explain the thesis. If for some reason you're an adult trying to take that kind of story seriously, you're probably going to get annoyed by all of the, "and this is why punching children is bad" type statements. We all know punching children is bad, but having to hear it over and over again might just make you mad enough to want to do it anyway. Now, obviously, as with most of these, I take extreme versions of these mistakes as ways to demonstrate them clearly. But in all likelihood, most of the time this mistake is made, it won't be that comically obvious. It's one thing if you're writing some sort of pamphlet or philosophical paper, but we're world building here. If your world stops feeling like a real place and more like a facade used to say one thing is good and strawmanning all other of that kind of thing is bad, it just isn't going to work for the audience. Mistake 7, the magnifying glass effect. This mistake is essentially when you laser focus so strongly on one part of your world that all other parts of it seem out of focus, as the title suggests. This one is easy to catch, and if you're doing it, you'll probably know immediately. I'll briefly clarify exactly what I mean, then explain why you should avoid it, as it doesn't happen without reason. The best way to imagine this effect is to think of a hypothetical fan wiki of your world. If the page containing one of your regions would be longer than all the rest put together, then you probably have this problem. However, the degree to which it is a problem will strongly depend. For example, in the original Star Wars, a group called the Bothans, which you probably don't even remember, is mentioned as being responsible for helping get the Death Star plans. It's not bad world building that we literally never hear about them again because they are only relevant for this little bit, and in the places that the movie is actually focused on, the world building is pretty good. However, take the first movie of the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens. Whatever you do or don't like about it otherwise, I don't really care. A key moment in the movie is when Starkiller Base blows up the whole New Republic. The problem is we don't know anything about the New Republic. When the Death Star blew up Alderaan in A New Hope, we knew that that's where Leia was from, so when it was blown up, we actually kind of cared. But when Starkiller Base blows up like 6 planets, it definitely does not have 6 times the impact because we don't know anything about those planets, so we just don't care. If a place in your world is going to be important, especially to some big upcoming plot point, you need to give it some depth. This doesn't always happen because sometimes we get fixated on the parts of our world that we really love and that we're really interested in, and we neglect others, but often you'll find that you'll like the other regions more as you work to develop them. But just like you can't expect your audience to cry when you kill off a side character with 2 lines, you can't expect them to care when an invading army ravages a countryside only mentioned once before. Mistake 8. Inconsistent magic systems. Magic systems are a near and dear part of many world-building processes and one of the most fun parts to work on. They're such an important and fundamental part of world-building where it's present, especially in fantasy, that I've got a whole video on them. But there's one key pitfall that can ruin any good magic system concept, and it's when the magic is applied inconsistently. The most accepted version of this is when a spell works or exists in a certain context, but in another context where it would be really useful, it inexplicably doesn't work or is forgotten about because the plot demands that the situation is solved in some other way. This is related to another concept of magic system mistakes, which is poor power scaling. People often really like giving their characters really powerful magic, and that is a lot of fun, but if you don't think it all the way through, these sorts of problems are going to crop up everywhere. There's a tendency to say this is something that only happens in soft magic systems, but that is not true. A good example is actually Harry Potter, which has a sort of middle ground system with defined rules. It's just that some of those rules are not things that the audience is privy to. In any case, they involve literal time travel in the 3rd book, Prisoner of Azkaban. However, when J.K. Rowling realized she couldn't just have time travel being a thing to worry about all the time, she made it to where a side character knocked over a shelf containing all the time travel devices, so now there's no more time travel. It's kind of BS. Another example of my own, a very simple one, is the idea of a character with fire magic. They're so good at fire magic that they can create fire in any real quantity at any time that they want. They use this to fight bad guys for a while, burn down enemy fortifications, and other such things. But they venture through a frozen tundra and the writer wants them to struggle and be cold. Logically, they shouldn't be that cold because they can create fire whenever and wherever they want. So in order to be consistent, either they shouldn't be cold or the cold itself will have to be magical in a way that counteracts their own magic. If they end up cold anyway with no explanation or they just forget how to make fire, it's going to feel unjustified. In general, whenever you give a character access to magic, you have to be willing to deal with all of the situations that magic will entail, even if it means you have to think harder about making the situations they end up in challenging. And finally, we have mistake 9, not enough or way too much world building. This final mistake doesn't really apply if you're just doing a world building project, but if you're running a tabletop RPG, writing a novel, or anything else that involves creating a story for others, you need to balance out the quantity of your world building with care. If you have too little world building, which is less common, you'll have an issue I've seen in person with creative writing. A story with fairly solid characters and plot, but no world for those characters or plot to exist in. It gives the audience a feeling that they can see the edges of the stage, so to speak. The world doesn't extend past the lens of the narrative. This can be a real shame because especially in fantasy or sci-fi, the idea that your characters are part of an authentic world that isn't our own, where their actions matter and people rely upon them, is one of the main appeals of these genres. Though I'll admit, if you're watching this video, this probably isn't the end of the spectrum you'll fall on. Instead, you may have too much world building. Now maybe it's a little funny to hear coming from a guy whose channel is basically built on talking about world building, but world building is at its most effective when taken in small doses alongside plot progression and character building. It's like a sandwich. Your plot and characters are the meat and cheese, but the world building is the bread. Without the bread, you don't have a sandwich, just a slab of meat and a piece of cheese, but if there's too much bread, then you don't get enough of the flavor from the meat and cheese. Often we world builders work for hours to develop the most interesting lore, most deep of histories, and heroic of ancient heroes. And don't stop to think that our audience isn't going to want to hear all of this at once. Instead, pace yourself and allow it to flow naturally. Avoid those dreaded as-you-know statements where in order to tell the audience something, characters talk at length about things they should already know about, breaking the fourth wall. Instead, work to weave in your lore naturally as the plot progresses. If your characters live in this world, they'll get around to talking about it, just give them some time. So I think that'll about wrap it up for this video. Hopefully the information within it has been helpful to you, and if it has, please consider liking and subscribing. We're super close to 1,000 subscribers and I'd love to hit it soon. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and remember, the greatest mistake of writing or world building is not to do it at all.